Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar by Dr. Shivaji Chakravarti. We are honored to have a session by him. Professor Chakravarti holds the position of the Director of National Institute of Technology Calicut from 2015 onwards. Formerly, he worked at Indian Institute of Science and Jadavpur University. He did his postdoctoral research at the Technical University Munich, Germany. He was the US NSF guest scientist at the Advanced Research Institute of Virginia Tech USA in 2003, AVH guest scientist at the Technical University Hamburg, Germany in 2005. He has published over 100 research papers in peer-reviewed international journals including 66 papers in IEEE Transactions and 26 papers in referred Indian journals. He was the chairman of IEEE India Council for 2017-18. He has one US patent, 2 Indian patents, and 2 software copyrights to his credit. He has authored 3 and edited 3 books. He has developed 3 online courses on numerical electric field computation. He is also the recipient of several other awards like the Jadavpur University Gold Medal, Pandit Madan Mohan Malaviya Memorial Medal by the Institute of Engineers, the Indian Ministry of Energy Department of Power Prize, and the Third Millennium Medal of IEEE Calcutta section in 2000. His current field of interest are high voltage field computation, condition monitoring of transformers, optimization of high voltage system, and lifelong learning technique. I take this opportunity to welcome all the participants to this session. Kindly note that students who are unable to attend a live session for various reasons including connectivity and lack of facility can view the video through ASAP YouTube channel. I once again welcome all to our webinar titled Experimental Program and Project-Based Learning. Over to you, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Marcy, and a very warm good morning from NIT Calicut. And I, at the very outset, thank the organizers for inviting me to present this webinar in front of all of you. To set the tone for this webinar, at the very beginning, I am presenting a few arguments which I have heard from different corners of the country at different times. Well, you may or may not agree to these arguments, but the fact is that people say all these things at different instants of time. So first one, which I'd like to say is this one, that very often people lack practical experience, and as a result, they are unable to relate theory with practice, and consequently unable to provide design experiences. So this is one argument I have heard. A second argument that I have heard is that our present systems reward research activities to a great extent. It's a fact. It rewards teaching experience to a lesser extent. But unfortunately, it does not reward practical experience to a significant extent. This is the second argument. And the third argument is, which is highly debatable, that experimentation is done by those people who are not creative researchers. Now, I would like to say that why people say like this. Is it that our experimental programs are not good enough? Or is it that people are just biased against experimentation? Let us not go into all those debates. But with this backdrop, I would like to present this webinar, which is divided into 2 parts. The first part is on experimental program. To start the experimental program part, I would like to make it very clear that I am not going to present any new concept here. What I am going to present is how to implement an experimental program Maybe it is in the BTech level, bachelor's level, or master's level, or even PhD level. So I will be mostly talking about the implementation part as I have learned throughout my life of 35 years in academia. So I am presenting this webinar in the form of certain questions that we have to consider for such experimental programs. The first fundamental question that we have to ask is, what is the problem? Sometimes we take it for granted that we know the problem. But really, do we know the problem? And I have divided this question into three sub-questions. The first one is, what is being studied? Let's say I am doing an experiment in the lab. Say, for example, I am measuring the property of some materials. Now, it could be one single property of single material, then I can go deeper into that experimentation to find out those properties. Or it could be a comparative study where some properties of some materials are being compared. That's fine. But then the next question automatically comes to my mind is, why is it studied? Is it just simply because of an academic interest? Or is there any other practical relevance to it? So therefore, the next question that comes is, how is it relevant? And when I say relevant, I'm talking about practical relevance. Let me give you a very simple example. Say we are doing an experimentation in the lab on determining the compressive strength of concrete. Well, that could be an academic exercise. But then if we tell the students that the same concrete is going to be used on site for a big structure, and that big structure has to withstand the load, whether it is static load or dynamic load. And depending on that, the overall sustainability of the structure is dependent. So then this relevance, when it becomes clear to the students or the scholars, I think they get more interested in doing the entire experimentation. And that brings out innovative angles also. Then the second question that is to be answered is, which physical laws are involved in this experimentation? Now, let me give you a very simple example. Say I am doing an experiment on the Ohm's law. Now, it could be such that only one particular or a few laws are involved which are specific to one area. But it may not be so in all experimentation. For example, if heating due to flow of current is involved, then heat flow related laws could be involved in the experimentation. Or if we have a relatively higher value of electrical fields, then electromagnetic radiation could be involved in the experimentation. So in those cases, multidisciplinary laws will be involved. We have to properly understand all these laws which are involved in the experimentation. That makes the fundamentals clear that what is being studied. Now coming to a more or less down-to-earth question, how accurately do we need to know the answer? This is a very important part of experimentation. So again, I have divided into two parts. The first part is, what is the target error band? Let's say my target error band is plus minus 5%. Now this is relatively high error band, so therefore my experimentation setup will be relatively simpler, it will be cheaper, and we can use common equipments or instruments to do my experimentation. But if I say that my error band is less than plus minus 1%, then a simple setup with a very common type of equipment may not work. So therefore, we need to know that how accurately we need to know the answer. Here I put forward a second question, which is, what is the tolerance? Here I have experienced in my life that in science and engineering, We talk a lot about error, etc., but hardly we talk about tolerance. Now, I give a simple example here that how is it important in our life. For example, if I want to walk from one wall of this room to the other wall, and if I say that my steps will be exactly 100 centimeter, it should not be 99 centimeter, it should not be 101 centimeter. In that case, can I talk? Can I walk? Possibly no. I give another example. Say I go back to my house, tell my wife that give me food, but I will take rice only 100 grams. I will not take 99 grams, I will not take 101 grams. Will it be possible for my wife to give me that rice? The answer is simply no. So therefore, in science and engineering, we should always consider the tolerance, because we have to specify our requirements. But if we always say the exact value, I don't think it will be possible. A simple example is, say in my lab, I require a sphere, metallic sphere of diameter 25 centimeter. If I tell somebody to make it, that make the sphere diameter 25 centimeter plus minus 10 millimeter or 5 millimeter, then probably many people will be able to make it and the cost will also be cheaper. But if I say that the diameter will be 25 centimeter plus minus less than 1 millimeter, then very good machining will be required. The cost will be very high and not everybody will be able to make it. So we have to always consider this tolerance aspect in science and engineering. Moving on to the next question, that what set of experiments might provide the answer? That means the experimental setup. There could be different types of setups possible, so we have to decide on that. But this will very much depend on the physical laws involved, the error band involved, as well as the tolerance. You can see on the screen a simple setup of an Ohm's law. Now here, if my error band is relatively higher, then I can use a very simple equipment, a simple instruments, as you can see, to do this experiment. But if I say my error band is very low, then these instruments will not be enough. So depending on my requirements, the experimental setup will change. Now coming to a more details, which is very important to understand, that which variables must be controlled and how well. Again, let me take the example of the Ohm's law experiment. We all know that in every experiment or every theoretical study, there are independent variables as well as dependent variables. But very often we ignore the control variables. Now I give the example that in Ohm's law experiment, I am taking voltage as my independent variable and I am taking current as my dependent variable. Now the control variable in this case is temperature. For a given voltage, a particular current will be obtained if the resistance is constant. But if the temperature changes, definitely the result will change. So this control variable has very significant influence on my experimentation. So therefore, we need to know the relationship that is being expected to exist between the independent and dependent variables. And at the same time, how much influence this control variable has over this relationship. The next question is, which quantities are to be measured and how accurately? Part of it I have already discussed earlier, that is the accuracy part. Now let us look at the quantities to be measured. For example, again taking the example of Ohm's law. Now I will measure voltage and current, and possibly I will measure temperature. But the range is significantly important. For example, let's say current. Is it in kiloamperes, amperes, or milliampere. The way we measure kiloampere and the way we measure milliampere are not same. So therefore, depending on the range of the quantity to be measured, my experimental setup is going to change a lot. Similarly, as discussed earlier, that depending on the required accuracy, the instrumentation will be different. Naturally, next question automatically comes to the mind is, what instrumentation need to be used? When I put forward this question, I would like to discuss 2 points here. That measurement that we do can be divided into 2 parts. First one is called direct measurement, second one is indirect measurement. Very simply, I would like to put forward what is direct measurement. Direct measurement means the quantity that I am going to measure is being fed to the instrument. For example, ammeter. That means the current that is being measured is fed to the ammeter, or the voltage that is being measured is fed to the voltmeter. Then what is indirect measurement? Let's say I am going to measure very low current. So what I can do is I can pass this current through a known resistance. Then the voltage drop across this known resistance I can measure with the help of a voltmeter. Then from the voltmeter reading and the value of the known resistance, I can calculate the current. So this is an indirect way of current measurement. Or say I'm measuring voltage and the voltage is very high. Then I cannot use a simple voltmeter. So what we do is we incorporate an in-between intermediate equipment. Sometimes it's a potential transformer, sometimes it's a potential divider. So what we do is we bring down the high voltage to a lower value and measure the lower value with a normal voltage. And then if we know the ratio of transformation, we can always calculate the high voltage from the low voltage. So this is also an indirect measurement. Similarly, let's say I'm measuring very high temperature. So what we can do is we can measure this temperature by knowing the change of the resistance due to temperature. We have to put a proper resistance which can withstand that temperature. And then we can measure the change of resistance. And then we can know the temperature, let's say of the order of 800 degrees centigrade. So it's an indirect measurement. So depending on what type of instrumentation is required, the experimental setup will change. And now comes the implementation part, that how are the data to be acquired, processed and stored. Here I would like to mention that in today's world, we always do digital data acquisition. So we'll require analog to digital converters. But now what type of AD converter we will require? That will depend on the required accuracy. If I don't require very high accuracy, we can use an 8-bit converter. If we require a very high accuracy, naturally we will require a much higher bit converter. So the data acquisition setup that we require will depend on the accuracy, and accordingly cost will also vary. Many a times when we perform the experimentation and take the data, sometimes the entire range, if we have to follow or if we have to do, a lot of readings have to be taken. So what we do, we perform some simulation. And from that simulation studies, we can identify the zone where we should concentrate. And then instead of doing the experimentation over the entire range, we can perform it within that decided zone. So the entire effort required, time required will be much reduced. So therefore here, simulation and experimentation go hand in hand. Many a times people say that nowadays people are not interested in experimentation. People are all doing simulation. I'm not going into that debate, but I say that simulation can go very well hand in hand with experimentation. Then the data that we record, the raw data, we have to understand that if it is on-site data, then there will be a lot of noises. So probably some sort of denoising will be required. Or let us say we are recording a large number of variables. Now, depending on the unit of the variables, the range of values could be quite different. And I give an example, again, by going back to Ohm's law. Let's say I am measuring voltage, current, and resistance. Now, the voltage could be of the order of kilovolts, current could be order of milliampere, whereas the resistance could be of the order of megaohms. Now, if we store the data directly in that form and try to analyze that, there will be a lot of problems. So what we do normalization. These are all pre-processing techniques. What is normalization? Very simple. We try to bring the data into a range of, say, plus 1 to minus 1 or 0 to 1. In that case, if we store the data in that form, the data analysis part will be much simpler. Many times, the data we record have sparsity. This is a little bit deeper into the data, which means that all the data are not of significant value. Only a small number of data are of significant value. In those cases, if we use the sparsity techniques, then storage of data will be reduced significantly and data analysis will be improved significantly. Then a very common point but important point to raise is that how many data points are to be taken and in what order. Let's say I am measuring voltage from 0 to 1000 volts. Now I can take 20 data points, I can take 100 measurement points, and they are all distributed uniformly over the entire range. Or it could be such that I'm not that interested from 0 to 500 volts, so I'm taking only 10 measurement points. But between 500 volt to 1000 volt, I am going to take 50 measurements. Similarly, there are other examples. I have done it personally in my life, that we vary the frequency from 1 millihertz to 1 kilohertz and take readings. Now, apparently it is very simple to state, but if you look at the range 1 millihertz to 1 kilohertz, it is of the order of 10 to the power 6. If we distribute the points uniformly over that range, it is impossible to take the readings. So we distribute these measurement points in a logarithmic manner. We take each decade and we take some 3, 5, 7, whatever it is in each decade. Then the important point for every scientist and particularly engineers is that whether whatever we have discussed can be done within the budget and the time constraint. Particularly from the engineering point of view, if I don't follow the budget and the time constraint, then every project falls through. So therefore, when we make an experimental setup, we have to do a budget analysis. Similarly, we have to consider all the practicalities so that the project can be done within the time constraints. Then the next question that is to be answered is, what type of data analysis need to be used? Nowadays, lot of data analysis part is available. Now, when we have recorded the data, particularly with the help of digital data acquisition, we have to understand that what we record is called a time series. That means there will be 2 columns of data. One column will be time and second column will be the data recorded. Whatever it is, it could be voltage, pressure, velocity, whatever it is. And this data over time varies and there will be some frequency of variation. If that frequency of variation remains constant over time, then we use Fourier transform and then that is called a domain transformation. That data is transferred from time domain to frequency domain. Why we do it? We want to understand the inherent features of the data. If the frequency varies over time, then wavelet transform can be used. Then in order to bring out the inherent features of the data, we need to use feature extraction techniques. And after getting the features, probably we have to classify those. So we can use classification techniques. When we have large number of data, now people talk about big data, there are always data which are redundant in nature. So therefore, it is always useful to use techniques to eliminate redundant data. And of course, we can use statistical analysis. We should never underestimate the importance of statistical analysis. But one analysis I would like to highlight is the uncertainty analysis. For example, many a times we talk about the error in our results. But error, whenever we talk about, then the question comes that how do you know what is the exact result? Do we know the exact result? The answer is no. So therefore, in addition to error analysis or accuracy analysis, we can also do uncertainty analysis. And if we do properly, the whole experimental program becomes very strong on its footing. While doing all these analysis, is there any unanticipated question raised by the data? Many a times we face that, and it need not be necessarily bad. Many times straight away we say that something is wrong in our experimentation. Yes, it could be true, but it could be also something new finding. So we have to ascertain that by proper data analysis. And finally, we have to present our data in a very effective and revealing way. It could be a bachelor's project which people have worked for 1 year, 2 semesters. It could be a master's project thesis. It could be a doctoral thesis for which people have worked for 3 to 4 years. Now, please remember that this report that we are going to prepare, then the examiner will read it, but he will read it or she will read it for maybe a couple of hours. So the way we are going to present is very important. And sometimes I say that all the other questions that we have answered earlier are basically science. But this question number 12 is not science. This is arts. In fact, fine arts. So what we need is self-explanatory, neatly drawn, simple diagrams, and where labeling should be unambiguous. I have seen students or scholars preparing diagrams in a software and then copy pasting it in a word processor. And while doing this, the diagram becomes unreadable. This is not a good technique. Similarly, you have to describe the measurement techniques, instrument used, fabrication technique, if any, tolerance, everything. So why is it so important? Because this report will be read by another group of students maybe next year. And in that case, if we don't write it properly, then it will be extremely difficult for another group to understand what we have done. Then comes what I call the dressing of the report, dressing of the publication. So there are ways of presentation of data. It could be in tabular form, it could be in graphical form. I like use of tables, but not too many. Presentation of data more in the graphical form. But overall, it should be a good mixture of tables and graphs. But importantly, the labeling of the curves must be unambiguous and clean. I have seen many reports where there are 3-4 graphs, but the labels are not clear. The quantities in x-axis and y-axis are not proper. The units, very importantly, whenever we plot the x and the y-axis, there must be proper units mentioned. And finally, each table, each figure should have a self-contained caption of each figure, bearing the necessary information. Then the whole presentation becomes very smart, very user or reader friendly. So then let us divide this into several phases of implementation. All these questions. Now question 1, 2, 3, 4, if we combine, it makes the planning phase. That means consider and evaluate the various approaches that can lead to an answer to the questions being asked. So here we'll ask, what is the problem? What are the physical laws, etc. Then comes the design phase. This is the important part, because if we not do this properly, the program falls flat. So whatever information you have got in the planning phase, then we have to make that specifications for the instrumentations needed, the details of the configuration of the experimental apparatus. And I would like to mention here that please prepare a proper bill of materials for the experiment and make a table. Write down the names of the equipments, instruments, but not the names only. What is the range of this equipment? What is the rating of this equipment? If it is in the power, then whether it is milliwatt or watts or even kilowatts. Like all those details, please prepare at the very beginning, at the planning and design phase. It helps immensely. Then we decide the test plan and we decide how we are going to run the experiments, how we are going to take the data, which order, etc. As I have already said, that it is a very important that everything should be done within the budget and time. So a properly time-stamped milestone map is to be prepared. This is very important in the design phase, that we say that in the first 2 months we do this, then in the second 2 months we do this. There may be overlap also. But if we have this properly time-stamped milestone, and after every milestone, if we know that whether we have achieved it or not, the project goes on in a very smooth manner. Then comes the construction phase. So we have to get all the individual components, then assemble the experimental setup. A very important point I would like to mention is that I have an instrument. Now, important point that I want to mention is that instrument properly calibrated? Many times we don't give proper importance to it. Now that instrument is going to give me some result. But is it reliable, that result? That depends on whether the instrument is calibrated or not. So please take necessary steps to see that the instruments are properly calibrated. Another important aspect is always consider the availability of space, that where this experimental setup will be placed. I know a case where a very good equipment was bought and it was placed in a lab, in a room, but very next to that room there was a big road. So whenever some big vehicle goes, there were a lot of vibrations and this equipment was not functioning. So that means that while planning and designing, this aspect was not considered. And what happened? The whole thing got disrupted and it got delayed. Then what I say is called debugging phase. That means after constructing the entire setup, first do some initial test runs. And while doing so, there may be unexpected problems. In fact, for any experimental program, we must be prepared to expect the unexpected. And when we face that, it may lead to some redesigning of the whole system or some changes in the operation of the experimental apparatus. And if it is so, then we have to do it. After that, actually, we do the experimental runs and we take the data and store it. Then comes the data analysis part. So that phase, and we do that. Here, if our data is producing something new, then we have to authenticate that. The question is, how do we authenticate? Simply saying that I have got this result in my lab, is that enough? The answer is no. There are two aspects of experimental program that we have to consider. One is called repeatability, the other is called reproducibility. Now, what is repeatability? Repeatability means that I have to perform this experiment in the same lab, with the same setup, but at different times. And the result should be repeatable. What is then reproducibility? It means that this same experiment has to be conducted at some other lab by some other group using their setup, and they should also get the similar results. If an experimental result is repeatable and reproducible, then this is properly authenticated. And anything new, if it is found, then it can be stated to be an authenticated finding. And finally, the answer to question 12 is the reporting phase. As I have already said, that with the help of this reporting, we should maximize the usefulness of our experimental results. So now if you ask me that what I have presented so far is nothing very outstanding or very exceptional, what I have tried to do is the proper structuring of an experimental program. So therefore, I go back to my initial arguments. So if an experimental program is performed in a structured manner, then one is able to relate theory with practice. One can do creative experimentation, sometimes very innovative experimentation. And as a result, one will get proper value of the practical experience gained. Now I move on to the catchword, that is the project-based learning. Today people talk a lot about project-based learning, but without knowing these experimental program details, I find that project-based learning is not properly dealt with. That is why I discussed in details the experimental program. But here again, the project-based learning that I am going to discuss is not any concept or something very deeper of the pedagogy. I am going to present the implementation. The whole presentation today is on the implementation. So basically, the viewpoint is that the traditional way of teaching engineering is no longer interesting to the students. So if we make a different approach, say for example, project-based learning, then it will give the students a real-world flavor and they might find it attractive. Then the question comes that whether the students learn as much as in the conventional teaching. The claim is that if they learn, that means the students learn at least as well, if not more, using the PBL format. This is the claim. I am not going to substantiate it. What I am going to say is that why PBL? Yes, it's a good way to reform our teaching in today's world and make the teaching more attractive by the inclusion of good projects, and particularly with the help of today's technologies, it could be really attractive if we can make a really blended education. And if this approach is combined with projects based on social needs, for example, a project that helps a community to deal with their daily life problem, then students are more involved and they get attracted to engineering, and at the same time develop important civic qualities, which is so important today. So what are the different steps of PBL implementation? Step 1, the instructor or the teacher, they introduce an ill-structured problem to the students. Here I would like to say that normally in our projects in the conventional teaching, we give a structured problem and we tell the students that this is what is to be done. But in PBL, there will be no spoon feeding. It's an ill-structured problem. Then what the students will have to do? The step 2, then the students will discuss the problem statement. That is a fundamental question I have said, that what is the problem, that what is being studied and why is it being studied. And then they will list the significant parts. That means they will divide the problem into sub-problems. And after that, the students will have to gather information, learn new concepts, principles probably, and develop skills so that they can engage themselves in the problem-solving process. The step 4, then the students will have to develop the problem statement from the ill-structured problem given. This is the biggest difference between the conventional project and the PBL. Then the students, a group of students, they will have to discuss among themselves, the team members. It's a teamwork. Another important aspect of PBL is that it's a teamwork. So they will discuss and come with a problem statement on which they have agreed. And then they will come to the teacher or the instructor, have a discussion, and if necessary, it will be modified. Then going to the step 5, that how this problem is to be solved. As I said earlier, that there could be different approaches for solution. So they will list out different solutions, and then they have to order them from strongest to weakest and choose the best one. And if not the best one, the one that is most likely to succeed. So therefore, the students will have here different options, and they will have to decide that which option is going to succeed. And finally, the students will have to make a list of actions with timeline and resources, as I have already discussed earlier. What is the step 7? Now the students will carry on their study, but they have to do it within the deadline. I again highlight that particularly for engineering students, it is very important to learn from the very beginning that a project has to be finished within the deadline. And then the students will have to write and present the solutions along with the problem. As stated earlier, they will summarize the processes used, but very importantly, the options considered and the difficulties encountered. Because this report, say this is a group of students of one particular batch, they have done it, but then the next batch of students, they might want to extend that work, the faculty might also want that. But if we don't write what has been done in the first option or first place, then it will be very difficult for the second batch to do it. So that will be the last step that we have already discussed in our earlier questions. Typical implementation of PBL, in my opinion, a very good example is the undergraduate final year project, because this is a 2-semester typical project. So the faculties and the students really get the time and the effort to be given for successful PBL. What are the requirements of PBL? It requires quality internet, library, and laboratory. These are the 3 main requirements. There is a common question that whether teachers have to spend more time or less time in PBL compared to conventional teaching. In fact, they have to spend much more time, because here it is not a structured learning. In a normal conventional class, we come with a structured coursework, with the prepared notes. We can give it to the students. We can deliver the contents. So it's a very well structured, and therefore efforts are relatively of lesser amount than the PBL, because it is ill structured. What type of projects should we do in UG, PG, PhD? Everybody talks about industry relevant projects. Yes, it is very important. But please remember one thing, that I cannot expect that I will wake up in the morning, have a cup of tea, and immediately a great idea of industry project will come to my mind. It never happens like that. So what is needed is that both the academic institution and the industry should come forward with a mission to work in unison and not in isolation. PBL, is there any problem? Yes, it not only depends on the students, but very much on the teachers or the faculty. If the teachers are not trained or mentally geared to do PBL teaching, then this approach will fall flat. And if it is part of the curriculum, the net result will be, there will be a lot of centers will crop up just outside the college or the university who will perform such projects for the students with a cost. So what is the need of the hour? That we should have well-equipped laboratories and well-trained teachers who are mentally geared to impart the project-based learning. Coming back to conventional teaching mode, so what best we can do in conventional teaching mode? The teachers or the faculties, we should try to make lectures more interesting. We should give practical anecdotes. We should show practical videos. And we should discuss real-world examples in the laboratory. The examples that very common are interactive software simulation and of course practical video. I just give one example from my own life. I am a high voltage engineer, so we have high voltage switches. So I want to teach what happens when the high voltage switch opens. Many times I have seen that the students think that the switch that they see in the domestic rooms is the same as the high voltage switch. It's absolutely not. So if I can show with a practical video that exactly what happens when a high voltage switch opens, then the students really can correlate what I am teaching and what is actually happening. So I conclude my presentation with the statement that, which I firmly believe, there is no substitute to good teaching. Thank you and best wishes.
Thank you, sir. We have a few questions here. How does PBL, project-based learning, differ from other forms of inquiry-based learning and experimental learning?
Well, I think there is slight misunderstanding here that project-based learning and experimental learning is, to my mind, is same. Just simply doing a simulation-based project is not really a project-based learning. Well, it can be, but basically what I tried to highlight is the experimental-based projects, because that gives the essence of the science and engineering. And inquiry-based learning, I think it is very much part of the project-based learning, because I have already told you that this project-based learning starts with an ill-structured problem. So it's the students who has to put forward the basic questions, which I have already discussed, that question 1 to 12, and they have to come out with the answers. So what I tried to highlight is that this project-based learning actually integrates these questions and the answers, and then the students are supposed to come out with the answer. Teachers are only simply to give some guidelines. Their role is to guide the students so that they don't get diverted. Any next question?
Yes, sir. How effective have you found the project-based learning compared to a conventional learning methods from your experience?
See, from my own experience, I have found that project-based learning, as I said, if it is to be successful, first of all, I need a laboratory. If I don't have a proper laboratory, then it is always better not to go for project-based learning. As I said, then only somebody else will do those things for the student. But if I have a good laboratory, and if I am the faculty, and if I am mentally geared to take up this challenge, then I have found that this is as good as conventional learning. I am not going to say that this is much better than conventional learning, but this is as good as conventional learning. But at least in one aspect, it is very useful that the students get a true flavor of the real life problem. Next question.
Okay, sir. Then next question. What are the training methods that are provided to teachers to facilitate project-based learning?
Training methods provided to the teachers.
Yeah, to facilitate the project-based learning.
Actually, I can tell you that what I did in my laboratory, that means my parent institute, that the young faculties, I took them as my student in one or two of such projects. And I gave them projects that let us do it together. So in those cases, they were the students and I was the faculty. And we followed this entire process. And I found that after a couple of, not much, 2-3 projects, if they do, the faculty, the young faculty, they take it up very, very well. That is my own experience.
Okay, sir. Next question. Is the sparsity technique that is used in order to reduce the dimensions of space and degrees of freedom?
Yeah, there are a lot of
Dr. Samar.
sparsity. Yeah, actually, I didn't wanted to go into that part in this presentation because that is more in the details of the analysis. So if anybody is interested, please go into the sparsity techniques. So there are different sparsity techniques. So depending on the data, first we have to see what is my data type. Depending on my data type, we have to use the sparsity techniques. And if we can use the proper sparsity techniques, it really helps in data storage as well as data analysis. But unfortunately, this presentation doesn't focus on that, so I have not prepared slides on that.
Okay, sir. One question. How can we introduce the experimental learning in our educational system? Not just the engineering side, generally in our educational system, how can we introduce the experimental learning?
See, exactly if you look at my slides in details, in one slide, I have showed that the best, I mean, in my opinion, of course, it is debatable, but best is the undergraduate final year project. Because in that case, there is time, generally 2 semesters, and faculties are assigned with a group of students. So what we can do from the very beginning is that we can give, as I said, there are 7 steps of this project-based learning. The first one is to give an unstructured problem. So the faculty can decide that what is my target, and based on that target, he or she can design an unstructured problem and start it from the very beginning. That means from the beginning of the 7th semester. This is my opinion that in the curriculum, if we have to incorporate, the best option is the incorporation in the final year project at the bachelor's level.
Okay, sir. Next question. Relevant to the lockdown situation, how can we emulate a PBL scenario remotely when the physical presence is not an option?
Yes. Now here, definitely, as I said, there are 3 requirements of PBL. One is good net connection, library and laboratory. So in the lockdown situation, the laboratory part is definitely not there. So we have to depend on the software part. So here we can think of some projects which can be done with the help of softwares. Now it could be software simulation or it could be something else, but that is to be decided by the faculty and the students concerned. But nowadays, with the help of very good softwares and the institute, if it gives remote access to the institutional digital resources, then this project-based learning can be done.
Okay, sir. One question. Is there any possibility that artificial intelligence will take over the PBL?
No, I don't think it can take over the PBL. What I think is that it will help PBL. Because see, nowadays these artificial intelligence, machine learning, these are becoming catchwords. But one thing I have to say is that they are to help us in our engineering studies. They are not the solution. So what we can use is that, say for example, what I said, that when I have an unstructured problem, there could be multiple solutions to it. And in those cases, the machine learning, machine intelligence can help me to decide that which one is probably going to succeed, which one is probably having a better possibility of giving me best results. So that can be achieved. But I don't think they will take over the project-based learning.
Okay, sir. Next question. Are there any professional organizations of experimental educators?
Which organization? Professional.
Professional organizations, yes, sir. Like organizations that are giving training for experimental educators.
See, honestly speaking, now there are a number of organizations all over the world. So the answer to that is yes. If you look into the net, there will be many who will say that we will provide this. But the question is, this cannot be a package. In my opinion, project-based learning cannot be given as a package. it is done by the faculties and the students together. So it is the duty of the faculty and the group of students to join hands and do the project-based learning a success.
Okay, sir.
Next.
And what kind of support does a student need for PBL, like project-based learning, and who can provide it? And also how to motivate students who are new to PBL?
Right. So as I said again, that there are three components to it. One is net connection. Now, mostly we are having net connection, excepting maybe very remote places. Second thing is library. Now with the digital library, that is also accessible to the students even from remote condition. The third part is the laboratory. And if laboratory is not available, then only we resort to the simulation study. But if these three conditions are available, that is net, library and laboratory, and if the students and the teachers are ready to join hands, this can be done. And the facilitator in such cases is, of course, the institute.
Okay, sir. And from your perspective, have you found any major disadvantage in this project-based learning system? Disadvantages?
Disadvantages, yes.
Yeah.
Big disadvantage. That is, if the say, for example, I tell you that I have an institute or I lead an institute, and we have incorporated project-based learning in our curriculum. So which means that faculties and students are bound to do project-based learning. But now what happens that if these two components, that means the faculty and the student, they are not mentally geared for that, this is the biggest challenge for what I have experienced. If we think that this is just like the conventional project, then it is going to fail.
Okay. So one more question. So if the students are working in groups in the project-based learning, and there are chances that one or two students may slack off and the others are putting in more effort. So how can the facilitator ensure that all the students are involved in this project-based learning, contributing their ideas and concepts?
Yes, that is in fact a very big challenge for the instructor. See, honestly speaking, again, my 35 years of teaching experience, if there is a group of 4 students, under no circumstances you can ensure that everybody will contribute equally. It never happens. There will be somebody who is really forward-coming and taking the leadership, and there will be others who might be a little bit follower type. That will be there. But as I said, that it is the duty of the instructor in this project-based learning to interact very closely with the student. That's why I said that instructor has to spend much more time in project-based learning than the conventional one. Because conventional learning is a structured one, project is a structured one. We give the structure to the students follow the structure. Whereas this one is ill-structured. And it goes entirely through the interaction of the faculty and the students. So faculty plays a big role here, a major role. So that is the most important part in my view, important point in my view.
Okay, sir.
Any other questions?
No, sir. We have come to the end of the questions. I'll hand over to Mercy, ma'am.
I, on behalf of Additional Skill Acquisition Program and the entire supporting team, extend a very hearty thanks to our speaker, Professor Dr. Shivaji Chakravarti, Director, NIT. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation and for taking your valuable time off your busy schedule to address our students. I thank all the participants and students. Once again, thank you all.